first thing, before anything you can see, is the smell. Wood smoke and animals and the open channel running down the middle of the road, bred from somewhere close. And underneath all of it, something sharper and stranger than any of that. Wet lime and stone dust. It is a little after dawn in Pompeii, on an autumn morning in the 70s of the 1st century, and the street you are standing on runs east out of the Forum. Shutters are coming off. A cart has committed itself to a lane it cannot reverse out of, and someone is shouting about it in the flat, unbothered way of a man who has had this argument before. 2 minutes' walk from here, at the top of the Forum, the largest temple in town has been standing broken for 17 years. The town is small. You could walk from the gate at one end to the gate at the other in about 20 minutes, and at this hour you would pass nearly everything anyone here needs. Bakeries, a laundry set up in what used to be somebody's front hall, a wool shop with the cloth already out on poles, a bar with 4 great jars sunk into its counter, and a kettle of water standing on it. How many people lived inside these walls is one of the questions that will not settle. The estimates run from about 6,000 to 20,000, depending on whether you count doorways, or water pipes, or seats in the amphitheatre. 11 or 12,000 is the figure most often given, and it is a guess with good arithmetic behind it. On the 5th of February, most probably in the year 62, the ground moved. Seneca gave earthquakes an entire book of his natural questions, and this one a chapter inside it, which is a fair measure of how far the news travelled. The scholarship still argues about the year, some make it 63. And that argument is a decent warning about how much of what follows is settled and how much is careful preference. What nobody disputes is the damage. Pompeii was not flattened. It was broken in the way a town is broken when the walls stay up and nothing quite lines up anymore. 17 years later, it is still being put right, and that is the thing about this place that almost nobody expects. Pompeii in these years is a building site. There is scaffolding. There is rubble sorted into piles by kind. Limestone in one heap, lava stone in another, broken roof tiles stacked in rows like plates in a rack. And, in one house, in the front hall where the mortar was being mixed, a heap of dry lime and sand with the print of something like a shovel still in it. The biggest bathhouse in town has been going up, slowly, since the earthquake. Only one side of the oldest is working, and the temple at the top of the Forum, the great one, the one every photograph of Pompeii is taken in front of now, has been sitting open to the weather since the year the ground moved, because nobody has got round to it. Anyone who has lived in a town with a long municipal project in it will know the shape of the aftermath, if not the cause. The hoarding that has been up so long, you have stopped reading the sign on it, the building you pass twice a day and could not now say what it is going to be. 17 years is time enough for a child to be born, learn to read, and start work in the shadow of the same unfinished wall. Some of the repairs were private, and one of them is still legible. On a wall on the east side of town, in the property of a woman named Julia Felix, someone painted a notice in letters big enough to read from the middle of the road. To let, it says, the elegant baths for respectable people. Shops with the rooms above them. Apartments from the 13th of August, next to the 13th of August, in the 6th year, 5 continuous years. It is an advertisement, red letters on white plaster, the ordinary business of a landlord with space to fill. It has outlasted every empire since. The emperor for most of this decade is Vespasian, a practical man with a reputation for watching money, who came to power out of a year of civil war and spent the rest of his life paying the bill for it. He dies in the June of 79, and his son Titus takes over. Neither of them has any particular reason to think about Pompeii, which is a middling town on a fertile coast, one of hundreds, and whose business is wine and oil and fish sauce and cloth. None of this reaches you. The street has been dug out and swept and roped off. The cart that could not reverse has been gone the best part of 2,000 years. The wall Julia Felix's notice was painted on is standing there this minute with a barrier in front of it. The reason any of it can be described at all is that in the year 79, Vesuvius buried the town and sealed the morning we have just walked into. It is an uncomfortable way to come by a record. It is also finished and sealed, and a very long way from here. What is left is a working town caught with its tools still out on the bench, an ordinary place in the middle of an ordinary decade, still owing money on repairs, full of people who woke this morning with things to do and no notion that anyone would ever be curious about them. We tend to go to the past for its great occasions, and the great occasions are mostly what got written down on purpose. An unfinished bathhouse is a different kind of record. Nobody meant to leave it. What we get to do with an hour like this one is read the things nobody meant to leave, which is a strange thing to be able to do, and it costs the people in them nothing at all. You are warm, and it is now, and the morning is long over. We can take it slowly. Before we go any further up this street, one small thing, and then we will not interrupt again. If you are finding that a slow walk through an ordinary Roman street is worth sitting with, or worth falling asleep to, which is just as good, consider subscribing, and we will keep opening these hours together. And let us know where you are listening from tonight, your city, your time zone. It is a good thing to know how far a quiet hour travels and whose dark it has reached. Now let us begin where we are standing with the street itself, and with what the stones underfoot have been keeping a record of all this time. The sound of the place is iron on stone. Iron-rimmed wheels on hard volcanic paving do not roll so much as knock. Every joint and rut in the road coming back up through the axle as its own separate blow, so that a loaded cart 2 streets off announces itself as clearly as one at the door. The sound arrives long before the cart does. Anyone who spent a working life here would have heard more in it than that. How heavy the load was, how fast it was going, and whether it was about to become somebody's problem. It runs the length of the town, forum to gate, and the men who dug it out gave it an Italian name, the Via dell'Abbondanza, which is certainly not what anybody walking up it in the 70s called it. What they did call it has not come down to us. The cart wedged in the lane behind us is not stuck because the driver is careless. It is stuck because of the way these streets are built, and the building is deliberate. The roadway sits sunk between 2 raised footways, and the curbs holding those footways up are high enough that stepping off one is a real step down, so the road lies in a trench of its own. Rain runs down it. The waste from the buildings on either side runs down it whether it rains or not, and the whole arrangement works precisely because the road is the lowest thing on the street. It is drainage first, and a road second, and it is not wide. On most of these streets there is room for 1 vehicle and none at all for a second, so that once a cart is in, it is in until the far end. The paving is basalt, quarried out of old lava flows, and cut into irregular slabs fitted together like a puzzle, whose pieces were each made separately. It is very hard stone, and it has still been worn into channels by the wheels, which is a fair indication of how much went over it and for how long. Set across the road at the crossing points are blocks that stand proud of the surface. Stepping stones put there so that anyone on foot can get from one footway to the other without going down into the water, and everything travelling in it. They are spaced with the axles in mind, A cart can straddle them if the driver lines it up, and a cart that does not line up hits them. If you were walking up this street at this hour, you would be up on the raised footway, looking down into the road the way a person looks into a gutter, because that is more or less what it is. At every doorway you would feel the curb come up under your foot. And at the crossings you would take the stepping stones without thinking about it, the way anyone takes a familiar set of stairs, knowing which of them was smooth on top and which had a corner off, because you would be going over the same 3 stones several times a day for as long as you lived here. Every few blocks the footway is interrupted by a stone basin at about waist height, with water running into it from a spout, and at this hour there are people at it. The water comes down from a tank up at the north gate where the aqueduct arrives, and from there it runs into 3 great lead mains laid under the footways. To keep the pressure workable across the length of the town, the engineers put up towers along those mains, about 6 meters, the height of a 2-story house, with lead cisterns on top, so that the water goes up, comes down at a usable pressure, and is tapped off along the way. That is the design, and when the whole of it is working, the fountains run day and night, because there is nothing on them to turn off. Whether the whole of it is working in this particular decade is a different question, and not a comfortable one. The front lip of the basin has been worn into a shallow dip, in the one place where a century of hands and cups have gone down. There is no law about any of this anywhere in the record. No surviving decree telling drivers which way to go up which street, no recorded fine for going the wrong way, nobody thanked in an inscription for having sorted the traffic out. What survives is the behaviour, and read off the stones, the behaviour turns out to be consistent enough that it can only have been a system. Most of what governs a modern junction works the same way. Practice that hardened into rule long before anyone thought to write it down. A wheel that clips a stepping stone does not bounce off it. Under the weight of a loaded cart, it slides across the face of the block, and the cut it leaves behind is not symmetrical. Where the wheel rides up onto the stone, it polishes the surface, and where it drops away on the far side, it tears at it instead. The mark has a direction built into it, the way a scratch across a table tells you which way the hand was moving. One stone gives you one cart. Every stone at every crossing in the town, catalogued, gives you the traffic. Somebody has done exactly that. Over 500 separate instances of wear and breakage, recorded across the town street by street, together with the 370 squat stone posts standing against the curbs at corners and gateways, where a wheel hub would otherwise have taken the edge off a wall. The work is Eric Polar's, and what came out of it is a traffic map of a Roman town. 84% of the named streets in Pompeii could take traffic in only one direction at a time, and 2/3 of all the paved surface that has been dug out is single lane. Where there was a choice, carts kept to the right. And the pattern is not random. There are streets that carried movement one way only, junctions arranged so the awkward turns happened where there was room to make them, and routes that look as though they were being kept deliberately clear. A scratch on a stone is evidence that one wheel went one way on one afternoon. 1,000 scratches all pointing the same way at the same junction is evidence of a habit, and that distinction is the whole basis of the argument. What the stones cannot tell us is whether the habit was enforced, or by whom, or what happened to a carter who ignored it. There may have been a rule with a fine attached to it. There may equally have been nothing behind it but the certainty that if you took that lane you would meet somebody coming the other way, and one of you would be reversing 200 yards, and it was not going to be the man with the heavier load. None of which is what makes this street memorable to walk up. What makes it memorable is that it changes every 30 paces. A bar with its counter open to the road and something on the boil in one of the jars, then a shopfront with cloth out on poles, and the sharp smell of the dye works behind it, then a doorway giving off nothing but cold air and wet plaster because the house behind it is being redone. Then the bakery, which beats all of them by a distance, and which has a queue. Stand far enough back and the whole town reads as a single piece of engineering, and a better one than it has any right to be. The road surface doubles as a drain, with the footways clear above it and the crossings letting people over without letting anything out. Stepping stones are spaced to the axles of the vehicles that actually use them, and the posts at the corners exist to take damage that would otherwise have gone into a wall. Water arrives under pressure at basins that need no attending to at all, and the circulation, whatever enforced it, keeps two loaded carts from meeting at the one place where neither of them can pass. None of that is monumental, and none of it earned anybody an inscription. It is the plain competence of a few thousand people who had worked out, across a couple of centuries, how to move carts and water, and each other through streets that were never going to be wide enough. The kind of competence that is invisible everywhere it exists, and unmistakable the moment it fails. And it is still physically there, worn into the stone at every crossing in the town, holding the shape of every decision anybody ever made about it. Among the things left behind in one house on the road to the Nola Gate are plumb bobs, small weights of bronze and iron, made to hang from a line so that whoever is building a wall can see whether the wall is going up straight. They have no other purpose whatever. Somebody was checking their work, put the weight down, and never picked it up again. The house came out of the ground in the January of 2023, in the middle of a job that nobody ever came back to finish, and parts of it are open now so you can stand in the room where the mixing was being done. The materials had been sorted room by room, the way any competent site sorts them. Limestone in one place, broken lava stone in another, and tile fragments and bits of pot kept apart from both, because crushed ceramic goes into mortar and rubble does not. Roof tiles were stacked in rows. Amphorae with their necks knocked off had lime stored inside them, which is what a jar becomes once it has finished being a jar, and blocks of yellow volcanic stone brought in from the Naples side of the bay had been kept back for the parts of the wall that would have to carry weight. There were chisels with the cutting edge squared straight across, the edge you want for dressing that particular stone, and an axe. And in the front hall where the mixing was being done, there was the heap of dry lime and sand we passed on the way up, with the print of something like a shovel still standing in the top of it. Anyone who has had work done on a house will recognize the geography of it at once. The good material kept dry, the rubble stacked where it will not be in the way, the sand where the water is, and one room given over entirely to mixing and therefore no longer really a room at all. It is a very particular kind of order. Not tidiness exactly, but the order of a job that has to be picked up again tomorrow morning. The heap turned out to be more interesting than a pile of building sand has any right to be. Inside it, when the material was analysed, were granules of quicklime several millimetres across, sitting there raw and dry in the mixture. That should not be there if the Romans were doing what the architectural manual Vitruvius wrote a century earlier appears to describe, which is slaking the lime with water first and adding it to the sand afterwards. What the heap shows instead is quicklime and volcanic sand mixed together dry, with the water going in last, at the point of use. And when water hits quicklime, it does more than wet it. The reaction runs hot, in this kind of mix sometimes past 200 degrees. So the mortar was warm when it went onto the wall, which makes the mark in the top of that heap a record of the moment before the water went in. On the walls of the same house, someone had been doing sums, There are sequences of numerals with symbols alongside them, set down where the job was actually happening, and nobody can say with any confidence what was being counted. The obvious candidates are quantities of material, or days worked, or money owed. A schedule, a delivery note, a running total that somebody needed to see. What is not in doubt is that a person stood in that room with a job to keep straight and did the arithmetic on the plaster because the plaster was there and paper was not. Somebody was paying for all of this, and the town's money is not entirely invisible. In another house not far off, in a wooden chest on the upper floor, excavators in 1875 found more than 150 wax writing tablets belonging to a man called Lucius Caecilius Jucundus. He was an auctioneer, which in a Roman town meant a good deal more than it sounds. He took a commission from the seller, and he lent the buyer the money to bid with, so that a single transaction paid him twice over. 16 of the tablets are contracts with the town of Pompeii itself. The rest, well over 100, are receipts from sales he ran on other people's behalf. And then they stop. Their last entries fall a few days before the 5th of February in the year 62. Nothing after that. It is generally read as meaning that Caecilius Jucundus died when the ground moved, and that is a reasonable reading, but a reading is what it is. A chest of receipts that ends is evidence that the receipts ended, and whether the man ended with them is not in the tablets. The earthquake broke walls, and it also broke the paperwork, and the paperwork is most of what this town has left to say for itself. Out of that one house and into the town, the same condition repeats itself in public. Pompeii had 4 sets of public baths in these years, and not one of them was in a normal state. The oldest and largest had been damaged badly enough that it was reduced to running on its women's side only. Another, out beyond the walls, was closed or very nearly. The one beside the forum had been repaired promptly and was carrying most of the town's business, and the 4th had never opened at all. That 4th one is worth stopping on, because of what it was going to be. It had been begun after the earthquake on a large plot near the centre, and it was not a replacement for what had fallen down. Its plan came off the model of the new baths Nero had put up in Rome. Far bigger, far better lit, with large windows, and with no separate women's section anywhere in it, which was how the newest baths in the capital were being laid out. Somebody in Pompeii had looked at what the capital was building and decided the town should have one too. It was never finished. The walls went up, the ground was cleared, and 17 years later the work was still going on. The outline of it is still there, and you can walk the plot. A large rectangle of leveled ground with walls that simply stop. That is not the condition of a town in decline. The popular Pompeii is a town caught at its peak and frozen there, complete and sealed. What the ground actually held was a town that had been knocked about badly, had spent 17 years and a great deal of money putting itself back together, and was in the middle of putting itself back together better. Imported stone in the load-bearing walls, a bathhouse on the newest plan in the empire. Nobody in this town was preserving anything. They were spending on credit at a pace. The lived consequence of that is simple enough to feel. The one facility everybody in town used, and needed because most houses had no means of heating water on that scale, was shut, or half shut, or not built yet, and the substitute was going to be private and was going to cost money. Anyone who has watched a pool or a library or a surgery close for works and then discovered that the alternative has a price on it knows where that arrives. Underneath the streets, the problem was worse, and this is the one place where the wording has to be careful. The aqueduct feeding the town had been built under Augustus a century earlier. At some point, its arrangements inside Pompeii were altered substantially, and that alteration is read as an attempt to keep water coming at a reduced supply. a system running under capacity, patched to keep running. By the 70s, a wholly new arrangement was under construction. And when excavators cut down into the waterhouse at the North Gate and into the oldest bathhouse, they found that lengths of the lead piping had been taken out before the eruption, pulled evidently for replacement. So the waterhouse at some point in this decade was open and out of service, and so was the bathhouse it fed. It does not mean the town was dry. There were wells and cisterns. Rainwater came off every roof. And there is nothing in the pipework to tell us how long any given stretch of the work took. What it means is narrower and more ordinary than a drought. The water was being worked on, the capacity was down, and anyone living here would have known which fountains were running this month and which were not. The way people know which lift in a building is the one that works. The notice on the wall makes a different kind of sense once all of that is in view. The property on the east side of town belonged to a woman named Julia Felix, and it was large enough to have a bath suite of its own, built for the household. After the earthquake, she opened it to the public and let out the rest. The shops along the street frontage, the rooms above those shops, the apartments. 5 continuous years, one August to another. It reads like an opportunity taken, and it was one. But it was also the obvious answer to 2 plain facts. The public baths were not coping, and a town that has lost houses has people in it who need somewhere to live. So the rooms above the shops filled up. That is the shape of housing after a disaster in any century. The existing town subdivided rather than a new one built. A stair off the pavement, a door at the top of it, one room behind the door, and a family in it who had been living somewhere better before the ground moved. You can still climb some of those stairs. They are narrow and steep. They come up straight off the street in the middle of a row of shops, and they are the part of Pompeii that nobody photographs. There was no kitchen in that room. There was no kitchen in most of the rented rooms in this town. No hearth, no flue, no water coming in, and no sensible way to keep an open fire on an upper floor of a building with timber in it. So the cooking was done somewhere else, and somewhere else was the street. Somebody has counted the places in Pompeii that sold food and drink, working from the one feature all of them share, a masonry counter built solid across the front of the shop, with large jars let down into the top of it. The count comes to 158. Better than 8 in 10 of them had somewhere on the premises to cook. If the town held 11 or 12,000 people, that works out at one counter for every 70 or 80 of them. The best preserved of them came out of the ground between 2019 and 2020, on a corner in the north of the town where 2 lanes cross. The smell reached further than the sight of it did. Wine going slightly warm in an open jar has a sweetness that carries, and something with pork in it has been over the heat since before daylight. Under both of those, there is fish. Not fresh fish, but fish salted and fermented down into sauce, which is the base note beneath a great deal of Roman cooking and smells like nothing sold in a street now. Fainter than any of it, charcoal and wet stone, because a counter like this gets sluiced down several times a day and the floor never entirely dries. The counter is painted and the paintings are the shop's advertising. Along the long face there is a sea nymph riding a seahorse with 2 amphorae beside her. Round on the short return, a rooster, a dog on a lead, and 2 mallard ducks hanging upside down by their feet, which is how game is displayed when it is for sale. Somebody wanted people walking past to know there was duck on. Scratched into the plaster frame beside the painted dog is a piece of obscene abuse aimed at somebody called Nicias. The excavator's rendering of it runs close to Nicias, you shameless shitter. Nicias was probably a Greek freedman, and he is generally taken to have been the man who ran the place. It is the sort of thing that gets written about a colleague rather than about a stranger. What was actually being sold turned out to be a harder question than it looks, and the answer came out of a laboratory rather than off the wall. The vessels standing in and around the counter still had material in them, so the bone fragments were identified to species and the organic residues analysed, with the work on site led by the park's anthropologist, Valeria Amoretti. The animals came out as duck, pig, goat and fish, including tuna, together with land snails. The small, edible kind, gathered rather than farmed, and eaten in quantity right across the Roman world. And in a vessel that had held wine there were broad beans, ground down. Ground beans in wine are not a garnish. They were used to lighten the colour of it and to change the taste, which suggests the wine was not being sold on its merits. At the bottom of that same vessel, laid flat, was a small tile, put there to keep the beans separate from the liquid sitting on top of them. The transaction happened in the street. The counter is built into the front of the shop with its long side to the road, so the customer stands on the pavement or in the doorway and is served across it. No table, no room. Nothing to sit on unless there is a back room and you are the kind of customer who gets shown into it. Some of these places had a bench or a small yard behind. Most did not. What they had was a counter at the right height for a person standing up, a queue behind that person, and a street going past, both. None of this was a treat. The modern instinct is to read a street full of counters as a street full of restaurants, and that gets it exactly backwards. You have almost certainly eaten a meal standing up, because there was nowhere to sit and no time to sit in it. Something out of a wrapper, on a walk between two other things, finished faster than you wanted because the alternative was not on offer. And if you have, you will know the other half of it too, that you did not choose the food so much as choose what was ready. That is nearer to the register. 158 counters in a town of 11,000 is what a place looks like when a great many of its people have no way of making a hot meal indoors, and somebody has noticed the gap and put a jar of stew in it. Back on the long street there is the counter we passed on the way in, the one with 4 jars let down into the top of it, and a kettle for water still standing on it. It goes by the name of a woman, Aselina, and there are rooms up a stair behind it, which makes it an inn as much as a bar. Jugs and dishes were found sitting out on the counter where somebody had left them. Behind the counter of another bar along the same street, belonging to a man named Vetutius Placidus, there is a painted panel, and it is not decoration either. A man stands at an altar making an offering. On each side of him, a figure in a tunic holds up a drinking horn. Along the bottom of the panel, 2 snakes come in from either edge towards the altar, which is what snakes do in Pompeian painting when the subject is protection. Which is to say, the shop had a god on the wall behind the till, and somebody's job included feeding him. On a wall in one of the town's inns, somebody kept the household accounts for 9 days running, and the wall survived. The prices are in the small bronze coin the Romans called the A's, and there were 16 of them to a silver denarius. 7 days before the Ides, the middle of the month, cheese 1, bread 8, oil 3, wine 3. The day after, bread 8, oil 5, onions 5. For the pot, 1. Bread for the slave 2, wine 2. The day after that, bread 8. Bread for the slave 4, spelt 3. That is 9 days of one household's outgoings, and there is a conclusion people like to draw from it. Bread appears every single day and is always the largest single item. Oil and wine come most days. Onions, cheese, and spelt turn up once each. The conclusion usually drawn is that food in Pompeii was cheap and that everybody could afford it, and it gets repeated a good deal, but the wall does not carry it. We have no idea what anyone in that household earned. A list of prices with no income beside it tells you what things cost, and nothing whatever about whether they were affordable. And the honest position is that we are holding half the sum. There is one line in the list that is itemized separately. Bread appears on the second day at 8, and then, further along the same day, bread for the slave at 2. On the third day, bread at 8 and bread for the slave at 4. Whoever kept these accounts kept those two purchases apart at different prices, because they were different bread. Whatever else is uncertain here, the bread is not. It is on every one of the 9 days at the top of the outgoings in a household that was buying 2 grades of it, and none of it came from that house, or from any of the 158 counters, but from one of about 40 buildings in this town where somebody kept a mill and an oven and started work a long time before anybody else. Before there is any light on the street, there is a smell coming out of one doorway, and it is the best smell in the town. Wood ash and hot stone underneath it, because the oven has been fired since the small hours, and the floor of it has to come all the way up to heat before anything can go in. Flour dust which gets into the air of a bakery and never entirely leaves it. And, further back in the building, an animal. The oven is a domed chamber of brick and stone with a low, arched mouth at the front, and firing it means burning wood inside it until the whole mass of it is hot, then raking the ash and embers out and putting the bread in against the bare stone. There is no thermostat and no second chance. The baker judges the heat by holding a hand to the mouth, by the colour of the dome, by how quickly a pinch of flour scorches on the floor, and having judged it, works fast, because from that point, the oven only cools. What comes out is a round loaf, low, flat across the top. It has been scored deeply from the middle outward into 8 even wedges, which makes it a loaf you divide with your hands, and not with a knife. There is a shallow depression at the centre, and a cord has been tied round the circumference tightly enough to leave a groove all the way round it. 81 of these came out of a single oven in 1862, in a bakery that goes by the name Modestus. They were carbonized, turned to charcoal, black right through, and holding their shape completely, with the scoring and the groove intact, and the cord still in place on some of them. Whether they were in the oven because they were baking, or because somebody had put them in for safekeeping, is not a thing anybody has been able to settle. Both readings have been argued. What the oven held was 81 loaves, and no way of telling which. Somebody has been through the town cataloguing the places that did this. Nicolas Montaix's count gives 39 bakeries that have actually been dug out, from something closer to 50 identified in total, which is the sort of gap you get when the real question is where a bakery stops being a bakery and starts being a house with an oven in it. They are spread across the town rather than clustered, each one serving the streets around it, which is what you would expect of a product that is worth nothing by the following afternoon. They needed water, and the water arrangements have been reconstructed for about 30 of them. 15 had both a cistern of their own and a connection to the mains. 8 or more were on the mains and had no cistern to fall back on, and 7 or more had a cistern and nothing else. In a decade when lengths of the town's lead piping were out of the ground for replacement, that is a distinction with consequences, and it is the difference between a bad week and a shut door. Bread starts a long way behind the oven, though, because before there is dough, there has to be flour, and in this town the flour was made in the same building. The mills are pairs of stones cut from hard volcanic rock, the lower one a solid cone standing about waist high, the upper one a hollow bell dropped over it so that the two surfaces very nearly touch. Grain goes in at the top of the bell. A wooden bar is fitted through the upper stone, and the bar is walked round and round, and as the bell turns on the cone, the grain is crushed between the two faces and comes out at the bottom as flour. There is nothing complicated in it. It is simply very heavy and it cannot stop, because a bakery that grinds for an hour has flour for an hour. The bar was walked by a donkey or a mule or a person, and in most of these rooms, it was probably all three at different times. Apuleius, writing a century later, made the hero of his novel a man turned into a donkey and sold to a miller, which is a fair indication of what the work was understood to be. The milling room in one of the bakeries in that same block of buildings came out of the ground at the end of 2023, and the first thing recorded about it was the way it was shut. The windows are small, set high in the wall and barred. There is no door to the outside at all. The only way in or out is inward, into the covered hall at the center of the house, which means that anybody in that room is inside the building, and leaving it means walking through the rest of it. The floor is paving slabs, and cut into those slabs are grooves, not wear, which is what the streets have, but deliberate cuts, running in a circle at the radius the animal walked. The reading of them is that they were made to give the hooves purchase so the animal would not slip, and to hold it to the circle without anybody needing to steer it. Which fits the other thing about that room, the detail from it that has travelled furthest. The animals were worked blindfold. The director of the archaeological park is Gabriel Zuchtriegel, and his words about the find are worth having exactly, because they are a good deal more careful than most of what was written about it afterwards. The room is, he said, testimony of the back-breaking work to which men, women, and animals were subjected in the ancient mill bakeries. And it is a space in which we have to imagine the presence of people of servile status whose freedom of movement the owner felt the need to restrict. We have to imagine. Nothing came out of that room to name anybody who was in it. No shackle, no collar, no bones, no inscription. What came out was architecture. A room with bars on the windows and no way out to the street. And the step from the architecture to the people who were kept inside it is an inference, and a strong one. The reporting dropped the hedge and called the place a prison. The archaeologist who dug it did not. The room is open now, and you can look into it from the hall. The grooves are still there in the floor, cut in their circle. Along the same street, in the bakery attached to a house that is known by the name of a painting inside it, excavators working in the summer of 2026 found the skeletons of two animals under a collapsed building, horses or donkeys or mules. The bones do not always separate them cleanly. One of them had been in the harness. At the base of its neck, where the harness would have sat, there were two iron rings lying one over the other. And about 10 centimeters further along the neck, there were 3 beads of glass paste, 1 light blue and 2 white, still stacked together in the order somebody had threaded them. Almost nobody signed the writing on the walls of this town. One man did, repeatedly, and the walls he was putting his name to ran the whole length of Pompeii. Street frontages, the flanks of shops, every stretch of plaster between one doorway and the next, the sides of tombs out past the gates, all of it lettered at head height and above in red and black. If you stood in front of one of those walls, you would be looking at more than one layer. The way a notice goes up is that somebody whitewashes a patch, waits for it to take, and paints on top, which means that underneath this year's letters there is last year's, and beneath that the year before, and where the wash has gone on thin, you can see them coming back through. You would be reading 2 elections at once. How much of it there is depends entirely on what you are counting. The painted election notices come to something over 2,500, and some counts push past 3. The scratched writing runs to many thousands more, and no 2 catalogues agree, because a collection that has been added to for 2 centuries and is still being added to does not have a final number. The order of magnitude is not in doubt. This is the largest body of ordinary writing to survive from anywhere in the ancient world. And it survives because a town was buried with its walls standing. The people who painted the notices were tradesmen doing a job. A pot of lime wash, a pot of red, a brush, a ladder. And there was no more reason to put a name on a wall than a plasterer has to sign a ceiling. His name was Aemilius Celer. On a notice asking the town to elect a man called Lucius Statius Receptus as one of the 2 senior magistrates, describing him as a worthy man and the neighbours as the ones doing the asking, there is a line along the bottom. Aemilius Celer wrote this, a neighbour. He identified himself by proximity. It is the only thing he says about himself anywhere, and it places him exactly. The writer, the candidate, and the wall all on one street. He signed something else as well, and that is the line that has made him faintly famous. On a notice advertising a public show at the right-hand edge, he wrote that he had done the work on his own, by the light of the moon. The sentence is genuinely there, and it needs handling carefully, because it is very easy to turn into something it is not. The man paying for that show is described on the same notice as perpetual priest of Nero Caesar, which dates it to Nero's reign. And Nero was dead by the year 68. So the moonlight is not a night in the 70s. It is a night in the 50s or 60s. And what the 70s had was the sentence itself, still legible on a wall, painted by a man who may or may not have still been working. We can say that somebody in this town once lettered a wall alone at night and thought it worth recording. Putting him in the decade we are walking through is a different matter, and doing it anyway is exactly how a record turns into an anecdote. The layering is also what makes the notices dateable, and that is the real gift of the whitewash. If a candidate's notice has nothing painted over it, his campaign was the last one on that wall. Work outward from that across the whole town. Which notice overlies which, whose name sits beneath whose, and a sequence comes out of it. James Franklin did that work and published it as a study of the town's electoral campaigns for the years 71 to 79, and the title is The Finding. Most of what survives on these walls belongs to the final decade, because the final decade is the layer nobody got round to covering, which made it a paid trade, and at election time, it was everywhere. Somebody was going about with a bucket of wash and a bucket of red, blanking last year's wall and putting up this year's on the fronts of private houses, with the owner's permission, on any surface facing a street that people used. The mechanics of that have not changed. A window in a house, a board on a verge, a hoarding at a junction. The surfaces are borrowed, the lettering is done by someone who does it for money, and the object is not persuasion so much as saturation. If a name is on 40 walls between here and the Forum, the name is in your head by the time you arrive. What lifts the notices above the mechanics is that they say who is asking. The bakers ask, and so do the muleteers, twice over for the same man, and the fruit sellers, one of whom is named alongside his trade. All the sellers of apples, with Helvius Vestalis, propose Marcus Holconius Priscus. Elsewhere, across the walls, the fullers, the dyers, the millers, the fishermen, the onion sellers, the jewellers, the hairdressers, the barbers, the hatters, the carpet makers. The man the muleteers wanted was Gaius Julius Polybius, and about 50 painted notices in this town carry his name. One of them, and only one, gives a reason. I ask you to make Gaius Julius Polybius Aedile, the junior of the 2 elected offices. He brings good bread. Whether that records a distribution he had already made or one he was promising is not recoverable. Either way, of 50 notices, 49 give a name and an office and nothing else, and the 50th gives a reason, and the reason is bread. Of those 2,500 notices, something like 60 carry women's names. That is a small proportion, and a strange one because no woman in a Roman town could vote, and none could stand for anything. 4 of the 60 come out of a single bar. The counter on the long street that goes by Asalina's name has election notices on the wall beside it, and the names on 4 of them are hers, and those of 3 women the graffiti elsewhere calls Asalina's girls, Smirina, Maria, and Egli. Not one of those names is Italian. Smirina's comes from Asia Minor, Maria's is Hebrew, Egel's is Greek, and the ordinary reading of that combination, foreign names in a bar in service, is that they were not free. What the 4 of them wanted was Gaius Lollius Fuscus for one of the 2 senior offices. The year was 79, and it was an election year. The painted notices are one kind of writing. The other kind is cut into the plaster with a nail, a stylus, or the point of a knife, and it is neither commissioned nor paid for. It happens at the height of a standing person's hand, in doorways and stairwells and passages, on the jams where people stand about waiting, and there is a great deal more of it than there is of the paint. A surprising amount is poetry, and most of the poetry is one poem. The opening line of the Aeneid, Arma virumque cano, I sing of arms and a man, turns up on these walls more than 15 times, whole or cut short, and there are over 50 scratchings that quote Virgil somewhere, most of them from the beginnings of the first 2 books. A good many are misspelled. Christina Milner's reading of that is the one that makes sense of it, and it does nobody's literary reputation any favours. A line quoted that often, in that many hands, wrongly, is not 50 people who have read the poem. Canonization had made those particular words, as she puts it, both deeply meaningful and completely meaningless. A way of gesturing at the whole of Roman literature without going anywhere near it. There are opening lines in every language that everybody knows, and almost nobody has finished, and knowing them has never been the same thing as reading. Some of the scratching is business. On one wall in the middle of July, somebody set down a transaction, an earring left, with a woman called Faustilla as security against a loan of 2 silver denarii, and the interest she took on it. A single as, one of the small bronze coins we were counting bread in. Another wall has her taking 8 of them on 15 denarii in November. A third names a hooded cloak as the security instead. The rate works out at something near 3 in 100. Whether all 3 name the same Faustilla is not certain, and the honest position is that we have a name, 3 transactions, and nothing to join them with except the name. That is a pattern worth stopping on. A builder's arithmetic went onto the plaster of a half-finished house. 9 days of a household's shopping went onto the wall of an inn. A moneylender's interest went onto a wall in July. In a town with no cheap paper, the wall was where you put a thing so that it would still be there tomorrow. And the consequence, which nobody intended, is that the ledgers survived and the letters did not. That leaves the question of whose voice any of this is, and it is not a comfortable one. The painted notices are the work of paid tradesmen writing what they were told to write. And whatever they tell us about the guilds who commissioned them, they are not those guilds speaking. The scratched writing is nearer to first hand, but the sheer quantity of it gets used routinely to argue that ordinary people here could read and write, and the quantity proves only that a fair number of them could hold a nail and copy a shape. Somebody who scratches a famous first line and gets it wrong has told us something true about themselves, and it is not that they were literate. What is beyond argument is that the walls were used. People came out of their houses and wrote on them. who to vote for, who owed what, who was a fool, what a pair of earrings was worth against 2 silver coins. And a great deal of what they wrote was about who they wanted, in the plainer sense of the word. Because a wall at hand height in a dark passage is where writing goes when saying it out loud is not an option. There is exactly one building anywhere in the Greek and Roman world that everybody agrees was built to be a brothel, and it is here. It stands on a corner about 2 minutes' walk from the Forum, and you can stand in the street outside it now, usually behind a queue, looking at the same doorway that people queued at then. What makes it certain is furniture that cannot be carried out. The small rooms off its ground floor corridor have platforms built into them in masonry, part of the wall itself, and taken together with the paintings above the doorways and the writing on the plaster. That is what settles the question. A table can be moved and the room becomes something else. Stone beds built into the fabric are a decision taken before anybody moved in. The Latin word for a place like this is lupanar, from lupa, she-wolf, which was the ordinary slang for the women who worked in one. That is the vocabulary of the period, and it is the first plain thing the evidence tells us. It is not hidden. There is no quarter of Pompeii set aside for this. The building sits between the Forum and the main north-south business street, in among shops and houses and people going to work. That siting has been argued over. One reading of Roman towns holds that prostitution was pushed to the edges and kept off respectable streets, a kind of moral zoning, and Thomas McGinn's study of the trade across the Roman world argues against it directly. This building's address is his best evidence. Whatever the Romans thought about the work, they did not think it needed to be somewhere else. The number is where Pompeii's reputation actually lives. Popular accounts make this a town riddled with brothels, and figures get quoted. 25 is the one that circulates most. Those 25 are not buildings like this one. They are rooms, single rooms above bars, back rooms off shops, spaces inside houses, identified as brothels on the strength of a suggestive painting, an obscene graffito, or a layout that could be read that way. Every one of them is a judgment call. The calls have been made differently by different scholars, and that is why the catalogues do not match. One building is certain, and everything past one is argument. For a place that has been open since 1862 and walked through by more people than almost any other room in this town, it went a very long time without being studied properly. The first systematic account of it, the whole structure, the excavation diaries, the objects found inside, the upper floor you are not walked along, and the graffiti read as a body rather than quoted for effect, was published in 2019 by Sarah Levin Richardson. 157 years. It is not hard to work out why. A subject can be famous and unexamined at the same time, and the two conditions tend to protect each other. What she found on the plaster is not what the reputation predicts. A great deal of it is obscene, explicitly and inventively so, in exactly the way anybody would expect of writing on the walls of a brothel, and that part needs no transcribing. The surprise is the rest. The people who worked there wrote as well. Both men and women worked in that building, selling to male clients, and the writing carries their side of it. Greetings, jokes, taunts, praise, and gifts, recorded as having been given. They named each other, complimented each other, insulted each other. In places it reads like the wall of any workplace where the same people see one another daily and have views about it. The reading that comes out of it is that these were people using the walls to speak as subjects rather than as goods, claiming things about themselves that nothing else in their lives allowed them to claim. That is worth saying carefully because it changes nothing about their legal condition. A woman who writes a boast on a wall at night is still owned in the morning. Both facts are on the same plaster. That is the part worth holding on to. The people in those rooms were at the very bottom of Roman society, most of them almost certainly enslaved, and almost nobody in their position anywhere in the empire left a word behind. What survives of the Roman world is overwhelmingly the record of people who could pay somebody to write for them. Tomb inscriptions, contracts, letters between men with property. The lines on those walls exist because a group of people at the bottom of that world happened to be working in a room with plaster on it, and because nobody afterwards thought the walls of a brothel were worth cleaning. If you have ever emptied a house, you know the shape of that. What survives is not what anybody chose to keep. It is the shopping list behind the drawer, the note left in a coat pocket, the thing that was never important enough to throw away. None of which makes the rooms anything other than what they were. They are small, they open off a corridor rather than onto daylight, and the paintings above the doorways get called a menu so often that the description has stuck, though they are decoration of a kind that turns up in ordinary houses here as well. Most of the people working in that building were not there by choice. Both of those things are true at once, and holding them together is the whole of the difficulty. So the walls of this town are full of what people wanted. What they actually had is almost entirely missing, and the reason for that is a good one. A Roman marriage was not registered anywhere. There was no license, no certificate, no compulsory ceremony, and no official who had to be informed. Two people were married because they and everybody around them behaved as though they were. A dowry usually moved, and the movement of property might well be written down, but the marriage itself generated no document at all. Divorce ran the same way in reverse and needed no grounds. This is Roman law in general, rather than anything Pompeii itself tells us. And that is precisely the point. A town can be dug out entire, every street and shop and thousands of lines of writing, and still say almost nothing about who was married to whom. What the archaeology does hold is the space. Households here were not laid out for privacy. Rooms open into rooms, walls are thin, and the rented single room at the top of a stair held whoever was in it, a couple and children, and somebody's mother. Sound went through everything. Whatever happened in those rooms happened within earshot of somebody who had not asked to hear it. And they were rooms of much the same size. A cell off the corridor in that building on the corner and a let room above a shop come out at nearly the same few paces of floor with one doorway and nowhere else to be. In a town where ground cost what it cost, nobody was building larger for either purpose. All of it, the wanting, the selling, the marrying, the sleeping, happened in rooms you could cross in 3 or 4 steps. On certain days, the whole town walks in one direction. The road runs east and then turns south, down towards the corner where the wall bends, and it fills as it goes. People coming out of side lanes, people stepping down off the raised footways, people who have shut a shop for the day and dropped the shutters across the counter. Nobody needs telling the way. At the bottom of it, set against the inside of the town wall, there is a building that can hold more people than live in Pompeii. Estimates of what it held vary, the way estimates of Roman capacities always do, and the figure usually given is somewhere near 20,000. Set that against a town of perhaps 11 or 12,000, and the arithmetic says something the building's size on its own does not. It was put up for the district rather than for the town. For Pompeii and the farms on the slopes above it, and the towns strung along the road, all of whom came in on the days when there was something on. Anyone who lives in a small place with a large ground in it knows what that does. The population doubles for an afternoon. Every bar on the route runs dry. There are people in the streets who do not know which way the streets go. And there are locals who arranged some weeks ago to be elsewhere. And there is a particular noise on the way in, which is not the sound of a crowd that has arrived, but of one still arriving. Uneven, coming in gusts with laughing running through it. If you were walking in that crowd, you would be moving more slowly than you wanted to. The way in is up and over, by stairs on the outside, and everything funnels. What was on offer got advertised exactly the way a candidate did, in red letters on a whitewashed patch of wall, lettered by a man who did it for money. One of those notices survives. It is the one signed at the right-hand edge, at night. And it lists what was coming. 20 pairs of fighters put up by a man named Satrius Valens, and 10 more pairs put up by his son over 5 days, the 8th of April to the 12th. 30 pairs across 5 days comes to 60 men, brought in, housed, fed, and matched against one another in front of the whole district, paid for out of one family's pocket and handed to the town as a gift. Nobody put on 30 pairs out of a personal enthusiasm for fighting. A show was what a man gave when he wanted an office or had just been given one, and both sides understood it as a payment. The town got the afternoon, the man got the credit, and the credit turned into names on walls. It put the games inside the same machinery as the election notices. Money, going out, standing, coming back. One of the men who did it was very young. Gaius Vestorius Priscus held the junior magistracy in this town and died in office at 22, and the show he had given is painted on the inside wall of the tomb he was buried in. A pair of fighters, a Thracian against a spearman, the winner still on his feet and the loser on the ground. The choice of moment is worth noticing. He did not have the fight painted, he had the end of it painted, with the thing decided, one man down and the other upright over him. And the man on the ground is down rather than dead. What came after that is not in the picture because in a fight of this kind it was not automatic, and the person paying for the painting evidently did not think the killing was the part to keep. The show that young man gave, whenever exactly it fell, was among the first this town had been legally allowed to hold in a decade. The crowd going down that road in the 70s is walking into a building the Roman Senate had ordered shut. In the year 59, there was a show here given by a man called Livius Regulus, who had been expelled from the Senate. A disgraced senator putting on games in a provincial town, which says something about what he had left to spend and what he was trying to buy with it. If you had been in the seats that afternoon, you would have heard it begin before you saw anything. There is a sound a crowd makes when it turns, and it is not louder than the sound before it, only differently pitched, and anybody who has been in a crowd knows it and cannot describe it. Pompeians and people from Nuceria, a short ride inland along the road, began by abusing one another and then took up stones, and at last, weapons. The advantage went to the Pompeians because the show was at Pompeii and the crowd was mostly theirs. And then the line that does not read like a Roman historian at all. A number of Nucerians were carried to Rome with their bodies mutilated by wounds, and many of them, Tacitus says, were mourning the deaths of children or of parents. That is very nearly everything anybody knows about it, and where it comes from matters. Tacitus was a senator writing in Rome more than 50 years afterwards, and he put the episode in because of what the Senate did about it. The seats did not interest him, so the evidence comes to us upside down from the way we would want it. The procedure is recorded in detail, and the event is a paragraph. What started it is not recorded, and neither is whether the two towns had a standing quarrel or whether the whole thing came out of one bad afternoon. There are no names except the organizers, no count of the dead, nothing about who threw first. What survives in full is the verdict, and the verdict went round the houses. Nero passed it to the Senate passed it to the consuls sent it back to the Senate. What the Senate then decided was that the people of Pompeii were forbidden to hold any public gathering of that kind for 10 years, that every association they had formed against the law was dissolved, and that Livinus and the others who had stirred it up were sent into exile. The ban is the part that gets quoted, but the clause about the associations is the more revealing one, because it tells us what Rome thought the problem had actually been. Local bodies of some kind had grown up in this town outside the law, and Rome took the view that they were capable of turning a crowd. Whether those were the same trade groups whose names go up all over the election walls, the bakers, the muleteers, the fullers, is not something Tacitus says, and it is the obvious question. The venue was shut and the organizations were broken up in the same sentence. The shape of that is not unfamiliar. Two towns with a rivalry, an away crowd at a fixture, a fight that goes past fighting, somebody dead. And then a governing body a long way off, which was not there and has no stake in the rivalry, closing the ground and disbanding the clubs. The people who went to the ground are punished for the people who organized it, and the punishment lands on a town rather than on the individuals in it. That is how authority has always handled crowds, because a crowd is the only part of it that can be reached. So the arena stood shut. Whether the full 10 years were served, or whether the thing was quietly let go somewhere in the middle, nobody wrote down. What is on the record is a decade in which the largest building in Pompeii had nothing in it. The clubs that ran the town's social life were formally dissolved, and the man who had paid for the show was living somewhere else, on the Senate's instruction, permanently. 20 years on from that verdict, in a house on the northwest side of town, the paint is new. In the front hall of it, when the room was cleared in the 1890s, there were two small bronze seals. A seal is a personal object, a stamp for pressing a mark into wax, so that a document, or a jar, or a door could be shown to have been closed by one particular person and nobody else. And these two carried names: Aulus Vettius Conviva and Aulus Vettius Restitutus. They were almost certainly brothers, and almost certainly freedmen, which is to say, men who had been somebody's property, and had been let go, or had bought themselves out. Their money came out of wine, which is what this coast grew and shipped. And one of them, Conviva, had got himself into the priesthood of the imperial cult. One of the very few public honours in a Roman town that a former slave was allowed to hold, and one he appears to have secured with a large donation to a public project. His name turns up somewhere else as well. It is on one of the wax tablets from the banker's chest, the archive that stops a few days before the ground moved. That places him in the town's business dealings before the earthquake, and in one of its best decorated houses afterwards. The house is among the most heavily painted in Pompeii, and the painting is not spread through it evenly. The rooms a visitor would be taken through: in at the door, into the hall, past the shallow pool in the floor that caught the rain off the roof, out to the colonnaded garden and the dining room beside it. Carry the best of it. The rooms a visitor would never see do not. That arrangement is the whole logic of a Roman house, and it is a logic anybody has been on the receiving end of. Somebody shows you round their home, and the route is not accidental. You are taken through the rooms that were finished properly, and the door that stays shut is the one behind which something never got done. A Roman house was built to be walked through by people who were meant to notice, and this one is that instinct with a great deal of money behind it. The house closed for restoration and stayed closed for 2 decades, and part of why it took that long is what an earlier generation of restorers had done to protect it. At some point in the 20th century, The paintings were coated in layers of paraffin wax with the intention of sealing them. What the wax did instead was damage what it was covering and dull it, so that the colours everybody had been photographing for decades were, in effect, the colours of the wax. The work of getting it off ran for 20 years, and the house opened again in the January of 2023. What came out from underneath was brighter than anything the 20th century had seen, with detail in it that had simply not been visible. Knowing that this house was exceptional means knowing what an unexceptional one looked like, and for that, somebody had to go and measure. Andrew Wallace Hadrill did that work through the 1980s and published it in 1994. A survey of the houses of Pompeii and Herculaneum, taken room by room, counting floor areas, counting decorated rooms against undecorated ones, assembling a picture of the distribution rather than a catalogue of the best examples. His figures on house sizes are what the population estimates for this town rest on. So when anybody says Pompeii held 11 or 12,000 people, that figure is coming, at some remove, out of a man walking the site with a tape measure. What comes out of that kind of counting is a town that refuses to sort itself into districts. There is no rich quarter here and no poor one. The largest houses and the smallest rooms sit on the same streets, frequently in the same block, and often enough inside the same set of walls. The reason is that a Roman house was not only somewhere to live, its street frontage was worth money, so the frontage was let out as shops. The rooms above those shops were worth money too, so they went separately, reached by their own stairs off the pavement, which meant a tenant never came through the house at all. And the interior could absorb work. A room off the garden becomes a workshop. A corner of the hall takes a bench. The money in a Pompeian house therefore faced inward and the earning faced out. Painted rooms sit deep in the plan, away from the street. The rentable surfaces are the skin. The consequence is that the grandest address on any street had poor people living in its outer wall, by design rather than by decline. And the traffic ran the other way as well. In the block on the Nola Road, 2 houses going back to the Samnite period, old, large, built long before Rome took this town over, had been turned over to trade. One of them had a laundry installed in its front hall. Workbenches and tubs for washing and for dyeing, standing in what would once have been the most formal room in the building. The other had a bakery with an oven in it. Both houses still had their painted rooms. There is a Poseidon with the nymph Amymone on one wall, and an Apollo chasing Daphne on another, and there are dyeing tubs in the hall in front of them. Nobody stripped the paintings out. The building simply began earning its living a different way, with the mythology left where it was. If you live in an old town, you have walked past this. The large house on the good corner, built for one family with servants, now holding a shop at street level, a surgery on the first floor, and 3 flats above that, 4 doorbells by the door, and a bin store where the coach house used to be. It happens because a building outlasts the economy that produced it, and then is worth too much to pull down, and too big for anybody to use, as it was meant to be used. The assumption running underneath all of this, that paint means money, has also turned out to need qualifying. In 2024, excavators uncovered a very small house here with its decoration intact and well done, painted as carefully as rooms several times the size. So the equation of a good wall with a wealthy owner, which a great deal of the naming and ranking of these houses has quietly depended on, has a hole in it. That leaves a question about the words we have been using. Is it right to talk about houses of the rich and houses of the poor in a town like this, when the same building was frequently both? The categories are ours. They come from towns that sorted themselves, where an address told you an income, and they get applied here because they are the categories we happen to have. What the plans actually show is a set of buildings, each containing several different amounts of money at once. You have probably lived in something like that. Anyone who has lived in a city has had a wall between them and somebody whose situation was not remotely comparable, and has known it and has not found it strange, because the building was simply the building. There was no statement in it. It was where the rooms happened to be. There is one more set of rooms in these plans, and they are the ones nobody has ever named a house after. Go through any of the large houses on the survey and you find them. Small rooms, often very small, opening off a passage rather than off the garden near the kitchen or the store or the stable, with plain floors and nothing on the walls at all. They are not on the route a visitor was taken. They do not appear in the photographs, and they are where the rest of the household slept. The day in a house like that started with somebody who was not the owner. Before the shutters came off, there was a fire to bring back out of the ash and water to fetch from the fountain at the corner and carry up the street. There was a pot to get over the heat and the lamps from the night before to trim and refill and set out. None of it could wait for the household to wake, because the household waking was the point by which all of it had to be done. And at the other end, when the last guest had gone and the lamps were out and the door was barred from the inside, somebody had to do the barring. Rooms of that kind are usually empty by the time anybody reaches them. One is not. A short walk north of the town wall, there is a villa out in the fields, at a place now called Civita Giuliana, and it has been under excavation since 2017. In one of its rooms, the diggers found the furniture still standing where it had been used. 3 beds, 2 of them 1.70 meters long, and the third 1.40 meters. A chamber pot, a wooden chest with metal objects and folded cloth inside it, and the shaft of a vehicle. The pole an animal is harnessed between, which somebody in that room had presumably been looking after. The wood itself is gone. What survived was the space it left in the hardened ash, and that space was filled with plaster and lifted out. So what exists now is a cast of a bed rather than a bed. You can read the measurements. That is as close as anybody gets to the people who slept on them. 2 adults, and at 1.40 meters, a child or somebody not yet grown. And the reading of the room, taking the shaft and the chest and the 3 beds together, is a family who worked at the villa. That room is one of many. The excavation has kept going, and by the end of 2025, the picture of the whole quarter had firmed up into figures. Something like 50 people housed in it, in rooms of about 16 square meters, with up to 3 beds in each. Ground floors, there are not floors in any finished sense, but beaten earth, tamped down by use. Upstairs was storage, and it held amphorae with broad beans in them, one of them half emptied, and a large basket of fruit, pears and apples, or something close to them. The identification is not settled. And a set of plaster casts taken from the voids on that floor, among them a door leaf with its iron studs still in place, and an object that may be a plough. The work has run since 2017, latterly on €140,000 written into the Italian budget for 2024. The reading the excavators have put on the food is that the people in these rooms were fed adequately, well enough, as it has been phrased from the site, to keep them productive. And it has been offered as something that complicates the old assumption that the enslaved ate worse than the free poor. That is their reading of it, and it is on the record. Also on the record, from the ground floor of the same building, are the remains of mice and rats. The director of the site has said 2 things about these rooms, 4 years apart, and both are worth having. In 2021, when the beds came out, he called the find a window into the precarious reality of people who seldom appear in historical sources. Sources, he added, written almost entirely by men belonging to the elite. In 2025, he said that human beings had been treated as tools, as machinery, but that humanity cannot be so easily erased. The first of those is a statement about evidence, and it is exactly right. The second is not a finding. It is a sentence a man reaches for after several years of standing in rooms like these. And it is worth noticing that he reaches for it, because nothing in the rooms supplies it. The beds are the length they are, the floors are earth, and the jar of beans is half empty. There is no consolation anywhere in the inventory, and the impulse to provide one is ours. Inside the walls, the same fact turns up in a form that takes 10 seconds to read, and then does not leave. The 9 days of household accounts on the wall of that inn have bread in them every single day. And twice in 3 days, itemized separately and at a lower price, they have bread for the slave. It is the separateness that does the work, rather than the price. Somebody sat down with the day's spending and wrote 2 lines where one would have covered it, because in that household, these were 2 different purchases of 2 different things for 2 different kinds of person. And the distinction was so ordinary that it needed no explaining to anybody who might read the wall. Nobody was making a point. It is a receipt. And that is most of what Roman slavery looks like in the evidence: bookkeeping. It is in the accounts, in the lists, in the second line at the lower price, and it is almost never in anything that announces itself. The difficulty running under all of this is that the evidence very rarely tells you who was owned. Take the 4 women whose names are on that election notice beside the bar. 3 of them appear elsewhere in the graffiti as Asalina's girls, and the standard reading of the phrase, 3 foreign names, working in a bar kept by a woman with a Roman one, is that they were her property. It is a reasonable reading, and it may well be right. It is also not what the words say. Asalina's girls could mean women she owned. It could equally mean women she had owned and then freed, which happened constantly, and which left a freed woman under continuing obligations to the person who had freed her. That was how Roman freeing worked. So that she went on working in the same bar, went on carrying a version of the same name, and was legally free the whole time. It could mean hired women with no formal tie at all. The Latin does not distinguish because the Latin did not need to. Everybody who read that wall knew which it was, and nobody wrote it down for us. And the line could be crossed, which is the other half of why it is so hard to see. There is a man from this town called Marcus Venerius Secundio who began as a public slave, owned not by a household but by the town of Pompeii itself, with the job of looking after the temple of Venus. He was freed, and he ended up in the priesthood of the imperial cult, the same body the 2 wine brothers had bought their way into, which in a Roman town was as high as a man of that origin could reach. We know all of that because it is written on stone at some length by his own arrangement. Nothing is written on stone about the 3 beds. The people in that room are known to us because a mountain preserved the shape of their bedding, and for no other reason whatever. Being freed generates a record because being freed was worth recording. Being owned generates almost nothing because being owned was ordinary. So what the evidence hands over is a set of names, some legal statuses that cannot always be pinned down, 3 beds with their lengths, a chamber pot, a chest, a jar of beans and a basket of fruit. What it does not hand over anywhere is the middle of the day. We have the hour they got up, more or less, because the household's morning required it. We have the room they came back to. Between those 2 things, there are 10 or 12 hours in which the 50 people at that villa, and however many there were inside the town, the proportion is one of the things nobody has settled, did something with their hands, all day, every day. The inscriptions are silent about nearly all of it. There is a smell on the long street that arrives as a physical sensation before it registers as a smell. It gets into the back of the nose and the top of the throat, sharp and faintly sweet, with something of stale sweat in it and something of a stable, and close up, it is strong enough to make you blink. If you stopped in the doorway, it would take a moment to separate the noise from the smell, water going somewhere and a wet, regular slapping. And then you would see men standing in low masonry stalls set into the floor, in liquid up to their calves, treading. The building is a house that stopped being a house. It has an upper story and a courtyard, and the shape of somewhere a family lived, and at some point the courtyard filled with tanks, and the ground floor was handed over to the work. It is known now by the name Stephanus, from a graffito on it, and it stands on the same street as the bars and the shop fronts. Fulling is the finishing of woolen cloth. It is what happens to wool between the loom and the wearer, and it is also what happens to a garment that has been worn and needs bringing back, so that the same premises handled new work and returns, which is one reason the trade is so easy to mistake for laundry. The person who worked out what actually went on in these rooms is Mikko Flor, whose study of the trade came out in 2013 and is the thing anybody now has to read. He went through the workshops of Pompeii and Ostia, the stalls, the basins, the layouts, the water supply, and reconstructed the sequence. Soaping, rinsing, drying, polishing, sulfuring, chalking. 6 operations in order, with treading and brushing running all the way through them. The soaping is where the cloth meets the alkali, and the treading is what drives it in. A man in a stall working the cloth under his feet for as long as it takes, which is not a short time. Then the rinsing in a chain of basins with water running from one down into the next, because a single tub of dirty water would put straight back what the treading had taken out. Then drying on frames, then raising the nap with a brush or a teasel and shearing it flat again, which is what gives finished woolen cloth its surface. Then sulfur, burned underneath the cloth where it hangs draped over a wicker frame to bleach it. Then chalk or fine white clay worked into the face of it. And then the urine. It was genuinely used, and the chemistry behind it is real. Urine left to stand breaks down and produces alkaline compounds, and alkali is what lifts grease out of wool. There is nothing folkloric in it. It worked, it cost almost nothing, and it was collected. The later tax was levied on urine taken from the public urinals, which tells you the collection was organized enough to be worth taxing. But it is one input at one stage of a 6-stage process, and the popular account has turned it into the whole trade. What a fuller actually was is a skilled finisher of expensive textiles who used, among other things, a cheap alkali that happened to be available in quantity because human beings produce it. Floer's correction has nothing squeamish in it. It is that describing this trade by its most disgusting ingredient is like describing a bakery by the smell of the flue. The tax, though, belongs to exactly this decade. A levy on urine had first been imposed under Nero. Vespasian brought it back around the year 70, when the treasury needed filling after a year of civil war, and it fell on urine collected from the public urinals. Who actually bore it is less clear than the anecdote makes it sound. A tax on the removal of a substance can land on the person getting rid of it or on the person carting it away, and the sources are not precise about which. The obvious candidates for paying are the trades that wanted the stuff, the fullers and the tanners, since they were the buyers and the demand was theirs. That is a reading rather than a documented fact, and it is worth marking as one. The anecdote is documented, and it is Suetonius who has it. Titus objected to the tax on grounds of decency, and his father held up a gold coin from the first collection and asked whether the smell of it offended him. Titus said it did not. Vespasian said that it came from urine. The phrase everybody quotes, "money does not stink," is not in Suetonius at all. It is the proverb that grew out of the story afterwards. There is a version of this in every economy. the unglamorous input nobody wants named, the waste stream, the byproduct the process cannot run without, turns out to be the most reliable thing in the world to tax, precisely because nobody can do without it, and nobody will stand up in public to defend it. Further along the same street, there was a clothier called Marcus Vasilius Verecundus, who did something unusual with the front of his premises. He had the work itself painted onto the outside wall. The panel shows the operations. Along the bottom of it, there are felt workers making cloth, a man carding, a man with the wicker frame, which is the same frame the sulphur burns under, and a scene of finished cloth being held up for a customer. Above all of that, presiding over the whole business, are the gods the trade belonged to: Mercury with a money bag, and Venus Pompeiana riding in a chariot pulled by elephants. Somebody on the same premises also scratched a note naming a garment, a linen tunic with spun gold worked into it. That is what the top end of this trade was handling. These were not marginal occupations. Both the fullers and the dyers turn up by name on the election walls, asking the town to vote for particular men, which means that as bodies they were worth having on your side, and that anybody counting votes counted theirs. A trade that can deliver an endorsement is a trade with money and members. The third of the town's great trades is the one that had already got into the food. Garum is fish and salt, left to ferment. The liquid drawn off it is the sauce. The sediment left behind in the vat is a cheaper product, with its own name and its own buyers. Between those, there were graded qualities that a customer could ask for by name. And one man here had cornered a great deal of it. Over 50 of the small, one-handled jars that garum travelled in have been found at Pompeii, carrying the stamp of Aulus Umbricius Scaurus, and the estimate is that something like a third of all the fish sauce coming out of this part of Italy came out of his operation. What Scaurus did with that is the detail worth having. In the front hall of his house, at each of the four corners of the shallow pool in the middle of the floor, there is a mosaic of a jar laid in black and white into the paving, and each jar carries a label worked into the mosaic. 3 of the 4 name him. One of them reads, in the clipped way these things are written, the flour of garum, made from mackerel, a product of Scaurus from the workshop of Scaurus. His is not the only name on the jars. 3 of the painted labels from Pompeii carry the name Umbritia Fortunata, described as a dealer in fish sauces, and her relation to Scaurus is not settled. The likeliest reading is that she was his freedwoman. He seems to have used his freedmen to run his workshops, and her second name is the kind commonly given to slaves. But she may have been a relative, a wife, or a sister. The labels do not say. What she was selling is the more interesting part. Her range included ordinary garum and a grade labelled castum, pure. Jars of pure garum have been found here, and pure sediment along with them. That word has attracted an argument because garum was made from every sort of fish, shellfish and scaleless fish included, which put most of it outside Jewish dietary law. So the reading has been offered. Robert Curtis is the scholar associated with it, that pure garum was produced for a Jewish market, and that there were enough Jews in this town to make that worth doing. It is a possibility worth putting on the table, and Curtis is careful with it himself. He does not claim that pure garum was made exclusively for Jewish buyers. A label meaning pure could be doing other work altogether. A different fish, a different process, some other requirement of ritual or of taste. The vessels are real and the word is real, and what the word was for is not established. All 3 of these trades did the same thing with their names. The fuller's premises are known to us by a name scratched on the wall. The clothier put his entire process on his own frontage, and the garum man put his brand into his floor, while the woman running one of his workshops put hers on the jars. Grade, producer, workshop, and in 2 cases the fish it was made from. stamped on the goods, painted on the plaster, laid into the paving. It is the same instinct that puts a maker's mark on the base of a plate and a name across a shop front, and it exists for the same reason. In a town of 11,000 people, the difference between your sauce and the next man's sauce is that yours has your name on it. The mosaic is still in the floor. 4 jars, one at each corner of the pool that caught the rain off the roof, in a room where the first thing any visitor did was look down. The Forum is the one part of this town built to be looked at from a distance. It is a long rectangle of open paving, closed off to wheeled traffic, with a colonnade running down both sides and public buildings packed in behind them. A covered market, a hall for the town's legal business, offices, temples. At the north end, closing the view, stands the largest temple in Pompeii. It has been a ruin for 17 years, and all round it, in the same period, buildings were going up. A temple rebuilt from the foundations, baths begun on a new plan, a large complex put up along the eastern side. All of that was private money spent on public fabric, at speed, in a town whose principal religious building stood open to the weather because nobody had got round to it. That is less contradictory than it sounds once you know how a Roman town paid for things. There was no public works budget in any sense we would recognize. Buildings got built when a private individual decided to build one, and private individuals decided to build one when there was something in it for them. So the question of what got repaired in Pompeii after the earthquake is really a question about what anybody wanted badly enough to buy. The offices themselves were few, and the arrangement was straightforward. Every year the town elected 4 men. 2 of them were the senior magistrates. The Latin title means plainly, the 2 men. And between them they held the judicial authority. They heard cases, and they presided. The other 2 were the junior pair with charge of the streets, the water supply, the markets, and the public buildings. Every 5th year the senior magistracy was elected with wider powers, and behind all 4 sat the council, a standing body of the town's propertied men, which is where a career actually lived, because a magistracy lasted a year and a council seat lasted for life. To stand for any of it, you had to be free-born. A man who had been a slave and had been freed was permanently excluded, whatever he was worth, and in this town some of them were worth a great deal. The one public dignity open to him was the priesthood of the imperial cult, which was real, and which was also a consolation prize. But the bar was on him, and not on his children. A son born after his father had been freed was freeborn, and a freeborn son with a rich father was eligible. One of them acted on that. The temple of Isis, over on the east side of town behind the theatres, had come down in the earthquake. It was rebuilt from its foundations, and the marble plaque set above the entrance of the rebuilt complex was found in 1766, broken into 37 pieces, and it says, "Who paid?" Numerius Papidius Celsinus, son of Numerius, rebuilt from its foundations at his own expense the temple of Isis, which had collapsed in an earthquake. Because of his generosity, the town councillors enrolled him into their number free of charge, although he was 6 years old. The money was his father's. The father was a wealthy freedman who could not hold office and could not sit on the council. His son could. So the temple went up in the son's name with the father's money, and the council understood the transaction perfectly and completed its own half of it. A seat, granted without the usual entry payment, to a child of 6. And then the arithmetic. The rebuilding follows the earthquake of 62, so a boy of 6 in the early 60s is a man of about 20 by the middle of the 70s. Somewhere in this town, in the decade we have been walking through, there is a young man in his early 20s who has held a council seat since before he could read, because his father bought it and put his name on a temple. The thing to notice about that inscription is that it is working as an advertisement rather than as an admission. Both halves of the deal are cut into the marble in the same sentence, the money given and the seat received for it. And whoever commissioned the wording clearly thought the second half improved the first. You will have seen the shape of this without needing it explained. A gift is made to an institution, a school, a hospital, a gallery. The gift is real, the institution genuinely needed it, and the money genuinely goes on the thing it was given for. And a name goes up on a wall or on a building or onto a list of people whose views the institution now has some reason to weigh. You know, both halves are in play. If you have ever sat in a room where that was happening, you will have watched the two things arrive in the same envelope, and neither of them get named. The arrangement holds precisely because nobody names the second one. What the Romans did differently is that they named it. They cut it into the marble, at eye level, over the door. So what should we make of a council that did that and then wrote it down proudly? The instinct is to reach for corruption, and corruption is the wrong tool. It requires a rule broken in private. Nothing here was private, and there does not appear to have been a rule. A Roman town expected its rich men to pay for its buildings, and it paid them back in standing, and putting a 6-year-old on the roll was an unusually literal instance of an entirely ordinary exchange. Is it fair to call the council shameless? Only by importing a category it did not have. What that plaque records is a town saying thank you in the most durable material available to it, in terms it expected everybody walking past to read as creditable. There was an older version of the same mechanism, and its monument is on the eastern side of the Forum. Around the year 2 or 3, which is 70-odd years before the decade we are in, a woman called Eumacia put up a large complex there at her own expense. A covered porch opening onto the Forum colonnade, a colonnaded courtyard behind it, and a vaulted corridor behind that. She dedicated the whole of it to Concordia Augusta, imperial harmony, and to pietas, which is duty. Her money had come from her father, who made it in brick. She held the public priesthood of Venus Pompeiana, which was as high as a woman in this town could go, and she was patroness of the Fullers. The Fullers put up a statue of her. It stood at the back of her own building, in the corridor behind the courtyard, dedicated by them. She had been dead a long time by the 70s. What was in the town in the decade we are walking through was her building rather than Eumacia herself. One of the largest structures on the Forum in daily use, generally taken to have served as the Fullers' headquarters. And at the back of it, a statue of a woman that a guild had paid for. And she could not vote or stand for anything either. No woman could. So the two people in this chapter who left the largest marks on the public fabric of Pompeii, a freedman's 6-year-old son and a brickmaker's daughter, were both outside the electorate altogether. The ballot was one route into the running of a Roman town. On this evidence, it was not the widest. There is one more thing about how the place was governed, and it comes out of a chest of wax tablets rather than off a wall. Of the tablets in the banker's archive, 16 are contracts between him and the town of Pompeii itself. So municipal government here turns up in a private businessman's filing as a counterparty. 16 agreements with a man who ran auctions, kept in the same box as his other clients. The temple went back up. It is a modest building for the size of the transaction, and it was done properly. New from the foundations, painted, roofed, working, with the boy's name cut in marble over the entrance so that everybody going in passed underneath it. And they did go in. Whatever the plaque above the door was doing, the room behind it was doing something else entirely. In several of the painted shrines in this town, there is a snake, and in some of them, the snake has got the egg. That is the detail worth starting on because it is not doing what the rest of the picture does. The snake runs along the bottom of the panel, underneath the figures, moving in towards a small altar. On the altar or on the ledge in front of it, there is something to eat, a piece of fruit or an egg. And in a number of these paintings, the artist has shown the snake taking it, head down, mouth on the egg, eating what had been put out for it. Somebody wanted the transaction completed on the wall. These shrines are fittings rather than destinations. They are not in a separate room, and they are not anywhere anybody travelled to. In most houses, the shrine stands in the front hall, the big open room you come into off the street, which is where the hearth had been in older Italian houses before chimneys and kitchens moved the fire elsewhere. The shrine stayed where the fire had been. In larger houses, there is often a second one further in, near the kitchen on the working side of the building, for the gods with a more practical remit. The form varies. Some are a niche cut into the wall with a painted surround. Others are built out from the plaster like the front of a small temple, with columns and a pediment at about chest height. And a good many are only a painting, the whole arrangement rendered flat, altar and figures and snake, with nothing three-dimensional in it at all. Inside the built ones there were often small bronze figures, and those have come out of the ground in quantity. Almost all of them have the same figures in them, which is how we know what they are. On either side, a young man in a yellow tunic with a green cloak over it, in motion rather than standing still, holding a drinking horn up in one hand and a shallow dish or a small bucket in the other. There are two of them, and they are the lares, the household's protective spirits, described in the Roman sources as sons of Mercury, which puts them in the same family as trade and messages and luck. In the middle, larger than either of them, stands a figure with a cornucopia in one arm and a shallow dish in the other, tipping the dish over a burning altar. That is the genius, and the word does not mean what the English word means. A genius is the presiding spirit of a thing, of a place, a household, a person, and in a domestic shrine it stands for the continuity of the family line and for the authority of the man at the head of it. So the household is making an offering. The figure in the middle of the picture is doing the offering, and the figure in the middle is also, in a sense, the household itself. Back at the bar on the long street, the best preserved of these panels is worth returning to at a different hour. If you were in that doorway before the shutters came off, you would find somebody already at it, and you would probably not notice them doing it. And if you did notice, you would not easily tell it apart from wiping down a counter. The shrine there is behind the till, at the working end of the room, where whoever is opening up is standing anyway. What has to happen is small, the ledge wiped, yesterday's offering cleared away, something fresh put out. Then the counter gets seen to, then the shutters go up, then the street. No ceremony is recorded for any of this. Nothing about it is a service. There is no priest, and nobody needs to be watching. Somebody does it because it is the first thing on the list. What went onto the ledge is recorded, and the list is domestic all the way through. Flowers, garlands on the days that warranted them, perfume, honey, wine, and cakes. Milk went to the lares specifically, and for the snake along the bottom of the picture, fruit and eggs. The timing is recorded as well. 3 days in every month. The days the Roman calendar already marked, and then the household's own anniversaries, and the birthday of the man at its head. On those days, the shrine got more than the daily wipe. It got laid out. That is the shape of it. Maintenance. A god in a niche in the front hall is not somewhere anybody went when they needed something. It is a fixture with a schedule attached, tended by whoever was up first, on days set by a calendar nobody in the household had chosen, whether or not anyone in the house felt a thing about it on the morning in question. The obligation is the practice, and the practice neither requires the feeling nor checks for it. Outside the house, the arrangement scales up and changes character. The town had its own patron, Venus, in a local version, Venus Pompeiana, who turns up on shop fronts and in paintings all over the place. And a priesthood of her that was the most senior position a woman here could hold. There was the imperial cult with its brotherhood of priests, which was the ladder for men who were barred from the other ladders. And there were temples on and around the forum for the state gods, the chief of which was the ruin at the north end. And there was the Egyptian one. The temple of Isis had come down in the earthquake and had gone straight back up again, which makes it the one substantial religious building in this town that was working properly in the 70s. The plaque over its door has been read already. What was going on behind the door is harder, which is where the difficulty with the whole subject becomes plain. We know an enormous amount about the fabric of religion at Pompeii, and almost nothing about the inside of it. We have the temple, its plan, its dimensions, its dedication, the name of the 6-year-old whose father paid for it. We do not have one person from this town saying what Isis was to them, or why an Egyptian goddess had a rebuilt temple in an Italian country town, or who was in the building on an ordinary morning. That limit applies to the shrine in the hall as well. A painted snake taking an egg is evidence that a household kept a practice. It is not evidence of what anybody in that household thought was happening when they put the egg out. The range of possible positions is wide, and every one of them is occupied somewhere in the world today. Somebody in that house may have believed, literally, that a protective spirit lived in the wall and ate the fruit. Somebody else under the same roof may have thought the whole business inherited nonsense and done it anyway, because the household did it, and it cost nothing, and there was no advantage in being the one who stopped. Both of those people could have been in the same room on the same morning, taking turns, and nothing in the painting would separate them. So, the honest position on religion in this town is that we have the liturgy and not the interior. We know what was done and how often and by whom and with what. And what any of it meant is a question the evidence was never going to answer, because nobody writes down what they take for granted. What is recoverable is the shape of the obligation, and the shape is familiar. Most households keep something: a shelf, a corner, a frame, a small object that gets moved and dusted and never thrown away. Flowers changed on a particular date, a candle lit on an anniversary, a grave visited in the same week every year by somebody who could not tell you exactly what they think the visit accomplishes. The keeping is not conditional on the believing. It is very often the last part still standing after the believing has gone, and it goes on being done because stopping would be a decision, and continuing is not. And over the top of the household's 3 days a month, there was the town's whole year. The Roman calendar was thick with fixed days, festivals for particular gods on particular dates, market days on a repeating cycle, days when business could not be conducted, and days when it could. Nobody living here had to remember much of it because the year arrived the same way every time. The same days closed, the same processions, the same month when the wine came in, and the same month when the fields were turned over. The year did not develop, it came round. And that is the one thing a year has that a life does not. Somebody in a small room on the west side of this town scratched a few words into the plaster to record that a girl had been born and put her name on it. Juvenia. That is the whole of the inscription. A birth, a name, and a wall. We do not know who wrote it, or whose room it was, or what relation the writer had to the child. There is no date on it, and there is nothing else about her anywhere. A town's year came round the same way every time, and a household could set its shrine out on the same 3 days for 40 years, with nothing changing. A birth does not work like that. It happens once, on one morning, and if nobody writes it down, then nothing marks it. And whatever registration existed for citizens has left no trace at all in this town. The impulse behind that piece of plaster is not obscure. A thing has happened. It is the largest thing that has happened to whoever is standing in that room. And there is a wall, so the wall gets it. People still do this on the inside of a cupboard door, on a beam in a loft, in the plaster behind where the new socket is going. A date, a name, sometimes a height. None of it is addressed to anybody in particular. It is a way of getting the moment onto something that will outlast the mood. Another child's name survives the same way, and it comes from the grandest possible setting. In the house of the two wine brothers, among the writing scratched on the plaster, there is a girl called Eutychus, taken to have been a slave in the household. That is what the wall gives us about her. Her age is not stated, nor what she did, nor whose property she was in any way that can be pinned down. And whether she was a child or a young woman is not something the word settles either. So from a town of 11 or 12,000 people, carrying more surviving writing on its walls than anywhere else in the ancient world, there are essentially 3 children whose names come down to us. A newborn girl scratched in a back room by somebody unidentifiable. A girl in service in a rich house scratched by somebody else unidentifiable. And a boy of 6 whose name is cut into marble over the door of a temple in letters sized to be read from the street, because his father had bought him a seat on the council. Only the 3rd of those was put there on purpose. The absence is not an accident of preservation. A Roman child was not yet a person the paperwork had any interest in. No property, no contracts, no office, no part in any transaction, nothing to tax, and nothing to receipt. Being 7 years old produced no document of any kind, and the walls of this town are very largely a record of transactions. So a child got into the written record by one of 3 routes: by dying and being commemorated, by being bought or sold since sales were documented, or by having a father with a reason to put the name up. What the ones who lived got by way of schooling depended almost entirely on their father's money. At the top of Roman society, somewhere between 10 and 15 people in every 100 were educated to a high standard. Grammar, rhetoric, literature in 2 languages, a private tutor, or a fee-paying teacher, years of it. That is the group whose writing survives to us as literature, and it is a small group. Below that, the picture is not the same thing scaled down, but something different in kind. The useful threshold lower down was not fluency, but something much smaller, recognizing letters and writing your own name. In a society where a great many children never learned to read Latin properly, that was a serious quantity of power. A person who could sign was a person who could witness a document, check a figure, read a price chalked on a board, and tell whether the thing they were putting a mark on said what they had been told it said. That is the level a great deal of the writing on these walls is coming from. Somebody who can form letters is not necessarily somebody who can read a page, and the 2 abilities come apart in ways that modern schooling has made hard to imagine. And when children lower down did get taught to read, what they were taught to read from is worth knowing. They learned on the poets. In Latin, that meant Virgil, and in Greek, it meant Homer, and both were already old, and both are hard. The Aeneid was about a century old by the 70s, and written in a high, compressed, deliberately difficult register so that a child working through the opening of it was doing something closer to an 8-year-old being taught to read out of Shakespeare than to anything in a modern classroom. That explains something about the walls. Those opening lines of the Aeneid that turn up, scratched all over this town, in dozens of hands, so often mangled. Those are school lines. They are what a person is left holding 20 years after being drilled in a text they could not fully read at the time. Christina Milner's study of the Pompeian quotations has a chapter on precisely this: quotation, education, and who gets to own a piece of literature. The reading that these lines are a gesture at Roman literary culture, and the reading that they are the residue of a schoolroom, are not in competition. They are the same fact, seen from the two ends of a life. If you were ever made to learn something by heart before you were able to understand it, you already know what that produces. What it produces is not comprehension, but a durable fragment. A first line, a stanza opening, the beginning of a prayer or an anthem or a passage of scripture, carried for the rest of your life at full strength with nothing behind it, and coming out slightly wrong when it comes out at all. It is one of the most reliable products of any education system that has ever existed, none of which gets us to a number. How many people in Pompeii could read is not a question the graffiti can answer, and every attempt to make them answer it runs into the same wall. A quantity of writing tells you that writing was common, and it does not tell you how many people could do more than copy a shape. There is no school register from this town, no list of pupils, and no teacher named anywhere. What survives from the classrooms is what was carried out of them inside people's heads and put on a wall decades later. And a great many children here never got as far as being drilled in anything. Infant mortality in the Roman world was high enough that a household could expect to lose children, and did, routinely, in a way that has no equivalent in a place with clean water and antibiotics. That is not a Pompeian finding. It is the background condition of every pre-modern population that has been studied. There is a further claim that circulates about this, and it needs handling carefully. A Greek historian writing about Rome's legendary beginnings records a rule requiring a family to raise all its sons and its eldest daughter, with the implication that other daughters need not be kept, exposed, which meant left to die or to be picked up by somebody, usually into slavery. That rule sits in a legendary past described by an author writing centuries after the period he is describing, and using it as evidence for what a family in Pompeii did in the year 75 is a considerable stretch. What it does record is the shape of an assumption that sons were kept and daughters were a question. Whether anybody in this town acted on it is not knowable from anything here. What is left is 3 names and a very large silence, and the silence has a shape. It is thinnest around the children who lived long enough to be useful to somebody, and thickest around the ones who never got that far. And the thing that decided which of those 2 a child ended up among was, overwhelmingly, the body. How the birth went, what the water carried, whether the fever turned. On that subject, this town is not silent at all. Among the bronze objects that came out of this town, there is one built around a screw. It is a tube, or something close to a tube, with a screw running down the axis of it and a handle at the end of the screw. Turning the handle drives the screw forward, and the screw pushes apart 3 or 4 curved blades set around it, so that the closed instrument opens outward under control and holds at whatever width it has been opened to. It is a speculum, made for the internal examination of women. It is also the most mechanically sophisticated object in the surgeon's box, and the design of it was not meaningfully improved on until the 20th century. It came out of a house on the northwest side of Pompeii, dug in 1770 by a man named Francesco La Vega, and the building has been called the House of the Surgeon ever since, on account of what was in it. The set is substantial. There are scalpels of the standard Roman kind, with a bronze handle and an iron blade, which is a design that lets the cutting edge be renewed without remaking the whole tool. Forceps in several sizes. Hooks, blunt and sharp, for lifting the edge of a wound or holding it open. And probes, long and fine, for exploring a wound before deciding what to do about it. There are cupping vessels as well. Bronze cups heated and then set against the skin so that as the air inside cools and contracts, it draws the flesh up into the cup, which was one of the standard interventions of ancient medicine across a very wide range of complaints. That name has to be handled with some care, though, and the reason is a decent lesson in how this material reaches us. Objects dug out of Pompeii in the 18th century went into royal and museum collections, and the records of where each thing had come from were kept variably or not at all. So a good deal of the surgical material now in Naples carries a Pompeian label and a shaky pedigree, and establishing which pieces genuinely came out of which building has been work for modern scholars rather than for the men who dug it. Ralph Jackson did much of that tracing. Lawrence Blakey's survey of Greek and Roman surgical instruments is where the wider picture got assembled. What the label licenses is narrower than it sounds. There was a set of surgical instruments in that house, and it is a good set. Whether every item now shown as having come from it actually did is a separate question, and one that took 2 centuries to start asking. The speculum is in a case in Naples now, and you can look at the thread on the screw. Nothing about it looks experimental. It is cut cleanly and evenly, by hand in bronze, by somebody who had made one before, and the object as a whole has the quality of a tool designed by the people who used it, and then refined by whoever found the first version awkward. You are not looking at a prototype. What you are looking at is a mature design. The object is only half of the fact, though, and the other half has to be said plainly. There was no anesthesia. The compounds available for pain in the Roman world, wine, preparations of opium poppy, mandrake root, blunted and confused sensation rather than removing it, and every procedure carried out with any of these instruments was carried out on a conscious person. That applies to the screw exactly as much as it applies to the scalpels. There is one thing to say about that, and it is not complicated. General anesthesia is about 180 years old. It is younger than photography and younger than the railway, and for the whole of human history before it, every operation anybody had was one they were awake for. There is nothing to do with that fact except to be glad of the accident of being born after it. The standard phrase for material like this ought to be refused. Roman surgical instruments get called advanced for their time, or ahead of their time, and both formulations are doing something dishonest. They imply that the past was trying to become us, and had got surprisingly close, which is a story about our position, rather than about theirs. Nobody in this town was working towards anything. A man with a box of good bronze tools and a working knowledge of anatomy was practicing the best available medicine, competently in his own present. That the design of one of his instruments happened to last 1800 years is a fact about the design, not a compliment we get to pay across the gap. The other reason to refuse the phrase is that it flatters everybody except the patient. None of which addresses what people were actually dying of, and the answer there has very little to do with surgery. The town's own arrangements are most of the picture. Waste ran down the middle of the streets in an open channel. Water came out of fountains that everybody put their hands and their cups into, and households drew as well from cisterns collecting off the roofs. Food was prepared over counters open to the street, in warm weather, in a coastal town where flies are a permanent condition. And nobody in this world had any concept of contagion in the sense we mean it. The connection between what was in the water and what happened in a child's gut 2 days later was simply not available to be made. So the great killer of children in a place like this was not one of the diseases that get names in the sources, but diarrheal illness, working through water and food, needing neither a plague year nor an unusual event. It needed a warm month. That is a general finding about pre-modern populations rather than anything Pompeii itself has told us. And it is the strongest thing anybody can say about why a household expected to lose children. Then there is the plumbing, about which a certain amount gets said. The mains under the pavements were lead, the tanks up on the towers were lead, and the service pipes into houses were lead. The English word for the trade still comes from the Latin word for the metal. So the inference gets made that the town was slowly poisoning itself, and that this is part of what was wrong with the Roman world in general. The honest position is that this is far less settled than it sounds, and that we are not going to settle it. Lead exposure in Roman towns was real and is measurable. Whether it was doing harm at the level of a population is a separate argument, and hard water running through a pipe lays down a scale on the inside of it that stands between the water and the metal. What can be said without argument is that a child in this town was in a great deal more danger from what came off a roof or out of a shared basin than from the pipe it had travelled through. The speculum belongs to a different part of the same picture. Its existence means somebody here was practicing medicine on women internally, which implies examinations and procedures rather than only the setting of bones and the dressing of wounds. Childbirth in any pre-modern population is the most dangerous recurring event in the life of a woman of childbearing age, and it recurs. There is nothing from Pompeii to add to that. No midwife named, no account of a delivery anywhere, no record of a single outcome. What there is a bronze instrument with a screw in it, and the fact that somebody thought it worth commissioning. That is the shape of the whole subject. We have the tools and not the people. No physician from Pompeii is named anywhere. There are no case notes, no fees recorded, no list of a practice's patients, nothing scratched on a wall by somebody who had been treated and had views about it. The instruments survive because they are bronze, and bronze survives. Everything that happened around them was made of softer material. So people here died of the things people died of: the gut, the lungs, the birth, the wound that went wrong, the fever that turned in the third week, the fall on a stair. In ordinary years, in ordinary numbers, with nothing written down about any of it. And then, having died, a few of them got something the dying itself never got. None of that record comes from a physician, and none of it from any account of an illness. It comes from what the people left behind them did next, out beyond the gates, and it was done in stone. A tomb is not built in a week. Stone has to be got and dressed, and a plot has to be bought on a road where plots are worth having. A mason is engaged, and after the mason a plasterer, and after the plasterer a painter, and the painter has to be told what to paint. Somewhere in there the wording of the inscription is settled by somebody, and then cut, letter by letter, by a man who charges by the letter. So between a death in this town and the thing that marks it, there is an interval of months, and the interval is full of arrangements. Every monument on the roads out of Pompeii therefore records two people, one who died, and one who was still upright afterwards and had to see to it. Outside the Vesuvius Gate at the north of the town, one of them was seen to in the year 70 or 71. It is built of the local volcanic stone with a solid base, altars worked into the decoration, and a chamber inside with paintings on the walls. The man it was built for was Gaius Vestorius Priscus, who had held the junior magistracy and died while still holding it, at 22. The dating comes from exactly that, from his standing for office and dying in it. The inscription says who paid, and it was his mother. The paintings inside are worth stopping over because somebody chose them. On one wall there is a garden, oleander behind a low fence with a fountain in front of it. On another there is silver, the plate and vessels of a funeral feast, laid out as though set for people who were coming. And on a third there is the pair of fighters from the show he gave as magistrate, the winner up and the loser down. A garden, a dinner service, and a fight. Those are the three things somebody put into a room that nobody was ever going to sit in. Roman law kept the dead outside the walls without exception, and the consequence is architectural. Every road leaving a Roman town runs between monuments, and the ones here begin immediately outside each gate and continue for as far as anybody with money wanted to be seen. Because the point of a roadside tomb is the road and the traffic on it, and the fact that everyone arriving has to come past you. The standard practice was cremation, the body burned, the ashes into a container, the container into a niche in the monument, often beside others belonging to the same household. Some of these tombs have niches by the several and small jars set into the wall. One tomb on the eastern side, out past the Sarno Gate, is an anomaly. It was found in July 2021 by the Archaeological Park working with a Spanish university, and the man inside it had not been burned. He had been laid whole in a sealed chamber a little over 1.5 meters by 2.5, with a covering over him of plant material, bark and leaves, bound together and soaked in resin or in honey. Because the chamber was sealed and the covering was what it was, he is partly mummified. His white hair is still there, and so is part of his left ear. He is the only adult from Pompeii, known to have been buried whole in the whole of the 1st century. The inscription on the front runs to some length, the career of a man who had been public property and finished in a priesthood, and it carries one item that had never surfaced in this town before. Among the things it records him as having done is the staging of performances, in Greek as well as in Latin. That is the first physical evidence anywhere at Pompeii for Greek theatre or Greek music being put on here. A town with 2 theatres, a full excavation history and thousands of lines of writing on its walls, and the fact arrived in 2021, off the front of a tomb, because somebody dug in a field east of the walls. Past the last of the monuments, the road stops being a street and becomes a road. The ground rises very slightly to the north. The fields begin, and what is in them is vines, running up the slope in rows towards the mountain, and the reason this stretch of coast had any money at all. Those vines are known in a way almost nothing else about Roman farming is known, and the method deserves explaining, because it is one of the more elegant things anybody has done with this material. A vine buried in volcanic debris does not survive. What survives is the hole it leaves. Stem and roots rot away underneath a deposit that has already set hard around them, and the space they occupied stays exactly where it was, empty in the shape of the plant. Pour plaster into that space, let it cure, clear away the surrounding material, and you have a cast of a root system that stopped growing in the 1st century. Wilhelmina Jastrzębski worked out how to do that at scale, not to a specimen but to whole enclosures, mapped and cast and measured across the full plot, so that what came out was a planting plan rather than a single plant. There is an enclosure inside the town walls, over near the amphitheatre that used to be called the cattle market, because that is what the men who first cleared it assumed it was. Excavation in the 1960s established that it had never been a market. By the end of the 1970 season, the count stood at 2,014 vine root cavities, with the same number of holes for the stakes that had held them up, and 58 fruit trees planted among them. The spacing between the vines matched almost exactly what Pliny the Elder and Columella recommend in their handbooks on farming, both of them writing in this same century. So there was a working commercial vineyard of 2,000 vines inside the walls of this town, laid out by the book, a few minutes' walk from the Forum. It was not the only ground being worked. Behind a row of houses on the south side, there was a garden large enough to hold an orchard, a vineyard and vegetable beds together, and the casts taken from it came out as grapes, olives, nuts, fruit, and vegetables, in quantities well past what one household would eat, which means it was grown to be sold elsewhere in the town. The picture of a dense Roman town with its food arriving from outside needs adjusting. Some of the food was arriving from 4 streets away. A mile or two out, at a place called Bosco Real, there is a farm that did nothing but wine. It was dug between 1977 and 1980. There is a press room, and beside it a cellar with 18 great jars sunk into the floor up to their shoulders, holding something in the region of 10,000 litres between them. The must came off the press, went into the jars, and stayed there. No dining room worth the name, no decoration to speak of. The building is a machine for turning grapes into wine, with somewhere for the people running it to sleep. If you were there in the early autumn, you would be there for the only weeks of the year that matter. The fruit comes off in a rush because it has to. A vineyard does not ripen politely in sequence, and once the sugar is right, the whole planting is right at once, and the window is very short. The mornings are cold enough to want a second layer, and the afternoons take it off you again. Your hands go sticky, then tacky, then black, and they stay that way for the whole of the picking because there is no point washing them. Underfoot, the ground is soft where the carts have been over it. And by the 3rd day, the smell is everywhere. Fruit going over in the sun in quantity. The vineyard around that farm has been cast as well, so the rows are marked on the ground where they were, and part of the plot has been replanted along the old lines. The vines standing there now follow the holes the previous ones left. And above all of it, closing the whole northern view, there is the mountain. It is a good mountain for the purpose. The soil off its flanks is volcanic and grows vines better than almost anything else in Italy, which is the entire economic basis of everything out here. Nobody working those rows had a reason to consider it as anything else. That has to be put carefully, because it is an argument from silence, and arguments from silence need declaring as such. Nothing in the surviving evidence from this town, not in the writing on the walls, not in the household shrines, not in a single inscription, suggests that anybody expected that mountain to do anything at all. No warning of any kind survives, and neither does any precaution. There had been no eruption inside any living person's memory or their grandparents', and the writers who looked at its shape and drew the correct inference were geographers working at a distance, rather than people living underneath it. The season itself has become an argument, and it is the most consequential small argument in the study of this place. The date everybody knows is the 24th of August, and it comes from letters written a generation afterwards by the younger Pliny, who was 17 at the time and watching from across the bay. Then, in 2018, in a newly opened block in the north of the town, excavators found something written on a wall in charcoal. It reads, "In the Roman way of counting backwards from the start of the following month, the 16th day before the 1st of November, which comes out as the 17th of October. The charcoal is the argument. It is a fragile material that does not last long on an exposed wall, so the reading is that the note was made very shortly before everything stopped, and that everything stopped in October. The plant evidence points the same way. Pomegranates and walnuts have come out of the deposits, and neither of those is off the tree in August. The case is well supported, and it is not closed. The date in Pliny is a manuscript reading, and manuscript readings are the kind of thing that can be transmitted wrongly, but a note in charcoal can, in principle, be older than it looks, and the careful summaries of the dispute are still written as the evidence for and against. What is fair to say is that the most famous date in Roman history is under revision, and that the physical evidence is on the side of autumn. Either way, the season out in the rows is the same season. There is a particular ease that comes with a year turning, while there is still work left in it. The heat has broken and the cold has not arrived. The days are shortening, and nobody minds yet, because the shortening is what makes an evening feel earned instead of cut short. The work is heavy and finite. A fortnight, 3 weeks, and then it is done, and there is something in the cellar to show for it. Any place that harvests anything has this, and it is one of the very few sensations that has not been improved on or replaced in 2,000 years. The light goes off the rows first, because the slope faces the way it faces, and if you are standing in them, you watch it leave in a particular order. The vines, then the roofs of the farm buildings, then the road, and then, last of all, the walls of the town a mile or two down the hill. By the time it reaches the walls, the light is coming in almost level, from the west, along the streets rather than down into them. That is the one time of day when a Roman street is properly lit end to end. For most of the afternoon, the buildings on either side put half of it in shadow. For that last half hour, the sun is low enough to come straight up the roadway, so the ruts fill with it. The curbs throw long shadows right across the paving, and the stepping stones at every crossing stand up out of the road with their worn tops shining. Then it goes off the upper stories, and then off the top of the wall, and the town is in shadow with a lit sky over it. The temperature goes with the light. An autumn evening on this coast drops away quickly once the sun is off the water, and the stone gives back what it took in during the day for an hour or two, and then stops giving it. And after that, the walls are colder than the air. The carts come off the road first, and not by regulation, but because of the stones. A driver who cannot see a stepping stone is a driver who is about to hit one, and hitting one with a loaded cart in the dark is how axles break. So the delivery traffic finishes while there is still light to line up by, and the roadway goes quiet a good while before anything else does. Along the frontages, the shutters start going up. Closing a counter is a set of small jobs. The jars covered, the food that will not keep taken off, the water tipped out, the surface sluiced down one last time, and the runoff sent into the channel. Then the boards go across the opening, and the shop that was a hole in the wall all day becomes a wall. Inside, the lamps come on, and they are not much. A Roman lamp is a closed clay vessel with a spout, a wick in the spout, and olive oil in the body of it. One wick gives roughly what one candle gives, enough to find a doorway by, enough to eat by if the food is close, not enough to read by comfortably, and nowhere near enough to work by. Anything that had to be done properly had been done in daylight, which is most of the reason the working day in this town started when it did. And the light cost money because the oil was food. Every hour a lamp burned was oil that could have been eaten or sold, which is why a house with a dozen of them lit was making a statement, and why most houses had one or two going with everybody sitting near them. The one bathhouse that was properly working shuts when its furnace is let go out, and the water in the pools begins cooling from that moment. Whoever was in there last comes out into a street that is already dark. The fountains do not shut because there is nothing on them to shut with. Wherever the pipe still had water in it that night, the basin went on filling and overflowing into the channel the whole way through until morning, to nobody. In the front halls, the shrines are where they were at the start of the day, with whatever was put out for them still sitting there. The building sites stand where they stood. Nothing about a construction site changes at night, except that the noise stops. The sorted heaps stay sorted. Limestone in one place, lava stone in another, the roof tiles in their rows. The scaffolding stays up. The bathhouse that had been going up since the earthquake is still going up, at precisely the rate it went up all day, which is to say, not at all between one evening and the next morning. The temple at the head of the forum is a dark shape with sky showing through the part of it that is missing, and by the 70s nobody was looking at it. 17 years is long enough for a ruin to become part of a skyline. Above the shops, the let rooms show as lines of light at the edges of the shutters, and from the street it is possible to see which of them have somebody in tonight and which do not. That is about the extent of what the street tells you after dark. A Roman town at night has no lighting of any kind. There is none because there was never any question of there being any. Nobody in the ancient world put light into a street. So once the sun is properly down, the streets of Pompeii are as dark as a field, with the difference that a field does not have a knee-high curb and an open channel running down the middle of it. Anybody who had to go out went with a lamp, or with somebody carrying one, or did not go. What is left after that is sound, the fountains and dogs, and somebody's shutters, and occasionally a cart out on the road beyond the gate where the surface is better and the risk is lower. And in the small hours from one street or another, an oven being fired, because bread has to be ready by morning and the stone has to come all the way up to heat before anything can go into it. That is the evening, and it is the last thing in this account that anybody living here would have recognized. What happened to Pompeii afterwards has been rewritten twice in the past 20 years, and each revision took away a story we had been telling ourselves. The first concerned who was there. For a very long time, the standard account held that the people who did not get out were the ones who could not. The old, the very young, the sick, the women. It is an appealing story because it flatters the survivors and it explains itself. Estelle Laser went through the skeletal material and tested it, working from measurement and observation on sex, on age at death, on pathology, and what came out was a fair cross-section of an ordinary population, a balance of men and women, a spread of ages, a sample of a town rather than the residue of one. The second concerned who they were to one another. In November 2024, a study in Current Biology reported ancient DNA recovered from 14 of the plaster casts while they were under restoration. In the house named for a golden bracelet, a group long described as a family, an adult wearing the bracelet with a child on their lap and two others close by, turned out to be 4 males, none of them related to any of the others. The adult was not the child's mother. In another pair read for generations as sisters, or as mother and daughter, at least one of the two was a man. 14 is a small number and the method has limits and the authors are careful about both. But the direction is not in doubt. The names those casts have carried for a century and a half were supplied by the people who dug them up. The third revision is the largest, and it arrived in 2025. In a block of buildings at the southern edge of the town, excavators found pottery, marble, ceramics, and ovens dating from after the eruption. Not immediately after, steadily after, for something like 400 years. People came back, survivors with no means of starting again anywhere else, and probably others from further off looking either for somewhere to live or for anything in the rubble still worth taking, moved into the wreckage of Pompeii and stayed until the 5th century. None of a Roman town's infrastructure or services was operating. The director of the site described what the archaeology shows as a precarious and grey agglomeration, a kind of camp. A favela, he said, among the still recognizable ruins of the Pompeii that once was. And the reason it took until 2025 to establish this is the part that ought to be said plainly. The traces were there and had been noticed before, but excavators working down through the site towards the frescoes and the intact houses treated the layers above them as overburden, and, in the site's own words, the faint traces of the reoccupation were literally removed and often swept away without any documentation. So the last 400 years of human life at Pompeii were shoveled off in order to reach the paintings. Nobody in that camp chose it. People go back to damaged places because the alternative is worse, because a wall that still stands is worth more than no wall, and because a place whose shape you already know, even ruined, is easier to survive in than a place you do not. That is the commonest reason anybody has ever lived anywhere difficult, and it is why the ruins of things stay populated. We came into this town looking for a finished thing, because a finished thing is what the past is usually good for. A mosaic, a tomb, a place caught whole at the moment it stopped. What is actually here is a set of jobs in progress. Pipes out of the ground and not yet back in, a bathhouse halfway up, a council seat bought for a child who could not read yet, a household's accounts kept on a wall because the wall was what there was. And the last thing that happened here was people making do among the parts of it still standing for 400 years in conditions nobody would have chosen. And almost nobody afterwards thought that worth recording. We would rather not pull a lesson out of it. It seems enough to notice that being partway through something is the ordinary condition of being alive, that this town is the largest surviving instance of it, and that the part of the record we came nearest to losing altogether was the least impressive part. If you have ever come back to a job you left half-finished and found the tools exactly where you set them down, you have had the small version of what this whole place is. So, the things this town left, gathered up, a heap of dry lime in a front hall with the print of something like a shovel standing in the top of it, 2 plumb bobs put down, somebody's arithmetic on the plaster because there was no paper. 81 loaves in a sealed oven, scored into 8 and still tied with their cord. 3 glass beads, 1 blue and 2 white, threaded into an animal's mane. Grooves cut into a floor so that a blindfolded donkey would not slip. An earring left as security on the 15th of July. 4 women's names beside a bar, backing a candidate in a town where not one of them could vote. 3 beds in a single room, the third of them 1.40 meters long. A basin lip worn into a dip, where a century of hands went down in the same place. A mother's inscription for a son of 22. White hair and part of an ear. 2,014 holes in the ground where the vines had been. All of it still where it was put. Nothing here needs anything from us. The town has been quiet for the best part of 2,000 years, and none of the people in it are waiting on anything. And out of the many thousands of lines written on those walls, there is one that tells us nothing whatever about the man who wrote it, except where he lived. Emilius Seller wrote this, a neighbour. Rest now.